we might get started, and I'll begin just by quickly acknowledging the country on which this workshop is taking. I'm based at the University of Sydney, and so I'll acknowledge that Critical Antiquities Workshop today is taking place on Gadigal land, and this is country that was stolen and never ceded. And this is particularly pertinent for us in Australia because we're having a big referendum on Saturday about granting the Indigenous population a special voice in Parliament. So I just big shout out to elders past, present and emerging. And now we turn to the subject of this workshop, which is really sort of a little bit of a departure from our normal format. It's less formal and more of an informal sort of conversation, if you like, or interview between myself and Charles Stocking, who's just recently taken up an associate professorship, is it?
Yeah, associate.
Yep, at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm envious because they also have the Center for Aegean Scripts there, which is just amazing. And you've got people like Tom Palaima and who, you know, that's some great stuff. But Charles is a early Greek poetry expert and also an authority on ancient Greek athletics and sport, amongst many other things, a Hesiod scholar. And he's produced this amazing book. It came out earlier this year, entitled Homer's Iliad and the Problem of Force. I'll put up an image in a little bit and drop a link to the book in the chat. And I'll also shamelessly place the cover of my book side by side so that there's a sort of, as you say, an intellectual genealogy that can be hinted at there. So I'll just I'll do that. I'll do that now, and just so that people can see what we're dealing with here. So I wonder if you can everyone see that. So there's Charles's book's got a lovely title. It's in the Classics in Theory series at Oxford University Press, and there's mine, came out in 2016. And I think that there is as you said very generously, an intellectual genealogy, and perhaps we're all imbibing the same water at the moment, and I'll explain why when I introduce the book. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to say a few things about what Charles's wonderful book is about. And then I'm just going to badger Charles with a few questions. They're mostly Dorothy Dix questions, which will allow him to expand on aspects of the book, which I think are superb. Some insights that he's generated through a lexical analysis of the various different words in Homer for types of force or types of compulsion, and some of the incredible conclusions that he's drawn from that. So what I'll do now is just introduce the book, and I'll just sort of put it into some kind of context. And I hope this is not too heady, but and I hope I get it right a bit, Charles. But maybe you can correct me in what follows. So Charles's new book, as I said, Homer's Iliad and the Problem of Force, I think is a very important work that will be seen marking the beginning of a new, perhaps what might be called a neo-Nietzschean moment in critical philology and classical studies. And I say neo-Nietzschean because the impulse in the book, I think, takes up Nietzsche's own summons to philology, made not only in his inaugural lecture when he was appointed to the professorship at Basel in classical philology, but in a lecture, the same lecture, which was also on Homer and the future of classical philology. This summons that Nietzsche issues, I think, is a demand that philology exit the feedback loop of a self-fascination with its own practice. That is to say, you know, like endlessly fixated on the syntax of particles or, you know, the metrical consequences of absent digammas or whatever that might be. And says that in so exiting that feedback loop, that philology become the basis for a philosophical intervention in the world itself. If philology is the science of close reading of texts, then it has latent within it the critical germ, I believe, the basis for a hermeneutics of critique. And this was, of course, Nietzsche's great insight. And Nietzsche's call is to let that, if you like, critical latency germinate, to unleash critical close reading upon the world of thought and society. Now, we philologists, if you forgive the pun, we philologists either repress this ability that has been nurtured by our sensitivity to words and texts, or we embrace it and we unleash it. And all critical interventions demand this preface, that is to say, the preface of philology, right? And I think Charles' book begins, as the title suggests, with a problem. I think it's very important that he frame the title of the book as the problem of force. After all, from the very beginning, Greek literature conceives of itself as preoccupied with problems, right? The problem of responsibility, the problem of causation, etc., etc. The problem of force. Where is this problem articulated? At first, when you open Charles's book, it's not entirely clear that the Iliad is itself a problematization of force. Rather, for the expression of the problem of force, Charles turns in the first instance to a more recent interpreter of the Iliad, and that is Simon Weil, and whose famous essay on the Iliad is concerned with the question of force. What Weil does is she expands the problem and articulates a view that the Iliad stages a terrible truth at the heart of the human condition, and that is that our subjectivity as human beings is negated by force. And when we are the victims of force or domination, we're subjected by it, when we're compelled, we are rendered inert, we are turned into objects, and we become things, and that force therefore annihilates us. Now, for Charles's book, this actually is not to be taken at face value, but rather induces closer analysis. He says we need to sort of subject this itself to a kind of critique. So, in a sense, Simon Weil has thrown down the gauntlet to the classicist to say, all right, is there a basis for this in the text, in a closed textual reading of the Iliad? So the problem of force is not simply a question of the internal or social dynamics of what we might call Homeric society, but it is a far more profound problem that Weil raises, which is that if the Iliad is a poem about force, that is to say it's about violence, power, domination, then it is also a poem about human subjectivity and the way that the human subject constitutes itself in language and in history. But we must pause, Charles tells us, and I think he's absolutely right. Charles halts before this philosophical abyss. If such a leap can be made from force to the human subject, can it be justified in the text itself? As it happens, there is no single idea of force expressed in Homer, but rather we have this basket of specific lexical items, each denoting types of action which refer to compulsion, domination, destruction, and so on. And they're all very quite specific. And so can we sweep this epic specificity in the lexicon of force to one side in our philosophical quest for the human subject as it was constituted at the beginning of Greek thought? So Charles's answer is no, we can't. We have to do the philology before we do the philosophy. Philology must precede philosophy. If the latter, philosophy, is to have its own, again, forgive the pun, its own thoughts. So then the next question in the problem of force becomes, how do we wrangle this herd of lexical items, right? This plurality of lexical terms for force. And has this been done before? So Charles says, well, yes and no. On the one hand, there are these two giants of philology, one German, one French, who have had a crack at force. On the one hand, Bruno Schnell, in his Entdeckung des Geistes, the origin of the beginnings of the Greek mind, concluded that the terminology of force reflected a primitive stage of thought in which the unity of the human subject was prevented by an understanding of ourselves beset on all sides by this plurality of external forces, none of which could be systematized around the organizing principle of selfhood or individuality. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's Émile Benveniste, the French Indo-Europeanist, who did not see plurality as such as a problem, but sought to see the lexical suite of terms evincing specific cultural, social, and institutional conditions. Now, he stopped short, Benveniste stopped short of historical conditions, and this is a question that I'm going to raise a bit later on. So on the one hand, Schnell has a diachronic pathway, which is informed by Hegel, German idealism, and is teleological, that says ultimately over the horizon of Homer is the autonomous, self-emerging, victorious from a kind of gigantomachy with external forces. And then there's, on the other hand, there's Benveniste's pathway, which is determinedly synchronic. That is to say, the idea of linguistic evolution is to be explicitly excluded. The idea of an evolution towards a kind of perfection or some teleology is to be excluded. But both Schnell and Benveniste are, while they are philological prefaces to the question of the problem of force, neither, as Charles rightly points out, however, is thorough and really only touches the surface and ignores a deep dive into the specificity of the lexicon. So this book, therefore, sets its task to excavate the ruins of Homeric force in all of its lexical complexity. The beautiful, concise introduction to Charles's book really contains all of this in a nutshell. So then, that's the point of departure, right? Which is to explore the philology of force and to place it on a firm footing in order to enable one to speak about Homeric subjectivity on the basis of semantic fidelity to the text of the Iliad. So then there's two next steps that Charles takes in relation to the problem of force, and they're very briefly summarized as follows. The first is, if there is this lexicon of force which is evinced by the Iliadic text, what's the Iliad itself doing as a poetic utterance with this lexicon, right? So what is the intervention that the Iliad itself is making? And then secondly, given that the way that the lexicon is specifically deployed by the Iliad, and I'll give away here one of his conclusions, which is it is almost always within the mouth of speaking subjects that lexicon is deployed, not within narrative, but it's spoken. It's a rhetorical lexicon, if you like. Then what is the entanglement between force on the one hand, speech on the other, and over the horizon, the subject's identity as one who speaks or one who is constituted as the person who says I, right? How is force, speech, and subjectivity all kind of bundled up together? And this is where Charles then makes the jump to light speed towards philosophy and says, right, well, philology must be the preface, but now we have to move past philology and actually have a kind of philosophical, critical framework within which to express how this lexicon is being deployed. So for Charles, this term to the philosophy is necessary, philosophy of the human subject, in other words. So here too, it seems the key thinkers, Derrida, Bourdieu, Michel Foucault, also found in Homer something fundamental about the expression of the history of the human subject, but they lacked the philological apparatus on which to give the Iliad its firm place in the history of the human subject in the European tradition. So on the one hand, Schnell and Benveniste have a philosophical idea, a philological idea which they don't give philosophical depth to. And on the other hand, the philosophers have a philosophical idea which they don't have the philological depth for. So Charles is kind of bringing these two halves together. So Charles is then beset with another problem, which is that these French philosophers, Bourdieu, Derrida, Foucault, are in our epoch now no longer au courant, right? They're or even to use a more negative term, they're passé, as you say, Charles. at least in Anglophone context, right? It's hard to bring these names out in classical studies without people kind of rolling their eyes. And this is to be lamented. This is a shame. And the entanglement of philosophy and philology in the French tradition is so close that we need to pay attention to why that is. And of course, this is, as I suggest, because of the inheritance of Nietzsche's injunction to entangle the two. So, can structuralism still be a valid approach? Charles asks, and to which he answers in the affirmative. He makes then what I believe to be one of the most important contributions this book, I think, will make, and that is that the French tradition of philosophy and critique that emerged from structuralism is inherently founded on philology, upon the question of how meaning arises through language to constitute the world itself. And in this way, the book, I think, stages the necessity of communication between philology and broader philosophical critique and vice versa. And ultimately, Charles's book causes the Iliad's own framing of the problem of force to erupt back into our own universe and forces us to rethink the way force, violence, its consequences, and the question of the firmness of our own conceptions of the way human consciousness and subjectivity is produced and understood. So I think, if that makes any sense as a sort of summary of I think what your book is doing, Charles, I hope I've done it some justice. It's only the tip of the iceberg of the richness that can be found. I think anybody who works in Greek literature, especially in Homer, will find extraordinarily thought-provoking book, and also what is there not to love about the deep philological rigor with which Charles then goes on to assess and analyze the lexical and semantic fields of these words for force, like kratos, alker, menos, stenos, and so on, which in itself, I think, makes the book valuable alone. So, Charles, thank you for writing this book, and I think it's very good. I've got a series of questions, and so for the next half hour or so, I see what your responses are to these questions. Some of them are just really going to kind of help you to flesh out what I've said a little bit more.
Please,
so,
yeah.
And then
thank you, Ben. It's a really generous introduction, and I appreciate it a lot. And I'm smiling because I do have a painting. I shouldn't even say this, but I have a painting of Edvard Munch's Nietzsche above my desk. So,
well,
but
look,
I would hesitate to ever call myself or bring the two words Neo and Nietzsche together. Very dangerous from a historical perspective. Were it not for the destabilizing effect of philology itself, that I'm okay with it. So,
well, I mean, what I love about this book, I think, is the way in which it makes an intervention, and it really illustrates the critical antiquities idea that Tristan and I had originally conceived, which is it causes the Iliad to erupt into our world, right? And by reading the Iliad through this lexicon of force, it destabilizes a whole universe of assumptions about individuality, of selfhood, of subjectivity, because it does so. It stages that as a performative act. I mean, and the way in which you, to jump to one of my later questions, the way in which you situate Achilles as on the one hand the most forceful deployer, the kind of the height of warrior violence, if you like, the most forceful character in the poem, and yet the one who seems to be most conscious of the limitations of human action, which is ultimately what you believe the Iliad is staging as an intervention, that effectively this is a poem about the limits of human action in relation to force and domination and compulsion. Is fantastic. So, okay, so what I might ask you first is what I didn't talk about in the introduction, which is the way that the Iliad distributes this language of force, and the way that it you adduce the way that this lexicon is deployed in speech as opposed to narrative. What do you think we should? What's our takeaway from the fact that the rhetoric, or the force, the language of force is actually a rhetoric of force in a sense.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was one of the most surprising features to begin with, and it's something that comes up especially in relationship to Simone Weil, because we want to associate I mean, of course, there's a lot of issues going backwards and forwards, like why force? Is it force? From a philological perspective, we could say none of these terms translates to force, but it's because they've been grouped from the scholarly perspective already, from Bruno Snell and Benveniste, and because it's just so much there in our own translation, both in French and in English, that I think the conglomeration works certainly, but like I said, the thing that was most surprising in doing, the first thing I always do is the word search. When I teach my graduate students, is the first thing you do is, I've told all of my graduate students that if you do a word search in Homer, you will never come up dry, never, and it just seems to be true. But what was so strange, again, is just the predominance of this constantly occurring in language and constantly occurring in speech. And then, of course, and not just speeches, but speech acts, right? As we like following, Richard Martin, and from that, and earlier, the whole idea of the performative, that what happens when this language that we want to think about as an action, and presumably either an act of violence or a signifier of the capacity for violence, what happens when we don't actually have that in the battle books, right? When it's not showing up, in the actual slaughter of soldiers, but it's only in the mouths of speakers when they're speaking in relationship to themselves. And to me, that's just such a striking fact that force becomes this level removed from material reality, from the materialism of violence, we could say. And I think just taking that fact in is important, because it gets to this question about how do we understand, I mean, both with regard to violence, how do we render violence meaningful to us? That has to happen through language. But then also the other part, which is that relationship in acts of violence, domination, or the implications of it, that it's between parties. And so it relates to this issue of subjectivity, and then it ultimately relates to how we relate to each other. And so it's this relationality where force also gets more into the Foucauldian model of, with the definition of power, that it's a relation, it's not a thing, right? And the same thing happens in force, that it's a language to the different terms are ways of establishing a relation. And it's always it's almost always from the perspective of the speaker in relation to somebody else. So it's very much part of a self-fashioning, even, of rendering these actual relations. So that's sort of, with all the various different terms, we see it constantly coming up in that relational capacity. And I think that itself is really important as an intervention in itself, right?
Yeah,
Can we conceptually? Sorry, go ahead, Ben, please.
No. I was just going to sort of add to that. Then one of the conclusions that you draw is, in fact, that in the Iliad or in the Homeric universe, there's no kind of independent notion of force. Then, like, there's no sort of idea that sort of kratos is this universal agency that, like we're all just sort of determined or subjected to this kind of independent notion of, but that force is something that arises and sort of takes place as a relation between humans and other humans, but also humans in the world and humans in the divine, and so on.
Yeah, and so that relationality, which is just both a relation between ourselves or between two different parties, that relationality extends with the observation that that Bruno Snell also made, that force is given by the gods. And that, to me, again, for me, the most important thing about philology is it actually allows us to question our own assumptions that we take in our reading of a text. And one of our first assumptions when we think of a concept like force or strength or power is that it's an attribute of the subject. It's a function of it's a function of a person's individual will. And to say that force comes from outside of oneself, right? Zeus gives Kratos to me, is a very strange concept, and it's unsettling from the modern perspective. And so just that, appreciating that fact, and also taking it seriously as though it were literal as opposed to just, well, that's just the way that they said what we think now, right? There's a sort of the suspension of disbelief. My Haitian voodoo professor taught me this when I was in graduate courses and taking a course on Haitian voodoo. He said, who am I to say you have to suspend disbelief in order to understand these perspectives? So what happens when we take seriously the idea and the belief that force is actually given from outside and not a function of my will? So then we have this double relationship of, from outside, ideally top down, and then also relational this way. So the levels of contingency there, as opposed to that solid thing that we want force to be, it defies that assumption or that desire that we have for it to be this thing. And related to that too, I just wanted to finish up, Ben, with another point there, which was also really striking, which is even with this top-down, what we could say is a top-down economy of force. This is an idea I borrowed from Brooke Holmes, this idea of the embodied economy, right? That our bodies ourselves are a function of these relations with the gods and with others and the interventions that happen. That we'd assume, well, Zeus gives Kratos, and Zeus obviously has the most Kratos. So therefore, you could think of it as some sort of a trickle-down economy, right? Where Zeus has the most Kratos and it comes down to us and we get some. But the Iliad even defies that, right? Because Zeus himself, at different points, he's questioned. The whole role of Thetis in the Iliad, emphasizes the fact that there's this relationship of Zeus having the most Kratos. It seems to be the case, and yet the interdependence that Zeus himself has with the community of gods is always there as well. So with regard to, as you say, the rhetoric of force, it's there even in Zeus's own language. And that to me is also, again, striking, is that every time we want to make a certain basic assumption, that we have about this idea of force as a definitive, tangible thing, the poem continues to defy that at every level. Okay, it's relational, but it's still top down, and Zeus has the most force. Well, actually, even his is rhetorical and it's relational. And so you can't ever pin it down. And that to me, you doing the footwork, as it were, through the language to be able to not really to show that you can't pin it down, right? But that you don't get to these definitive accounts of, the thingness of force or its stability. To me, that was just a really striking fact that comes through once you start to read the poem in this way.
Well, I mean, this feels like a wonderful vindication for me, at least, because I felt the same way about value, right? I mean, value is relational in the Iliad as well. This is a particularly signal feature of a pre-monetary economy where, in order for value to arise, it has to arise as the construction of sort of intimate relationships between two people or more, in which an object comes to signify that intimacy. And when you were talking about the trickle down, I was thinking of the genealogy of the scepter of made by Hephaestus but given by Zeus to the Atreidae and so on. The way in which the value of the way in which the value of the scepter, but also the way that it signifies Kratos and the right to speak and so on, is constituted as this genealogical kind of inheritance, if you like, in which there's this kind of umbilical tracing back through relations that sort of gives it its power. Is sort of puts a whole new spin on the kind of idea of catalogs and genealogies, as these, rehearsing these networks of power and value as they go back through time. And also, when you're talking then too about that, made me think of the way in which even someone like Pindar cannot conceive of even speaking or being a poet unless it's in partnership with divine forces which confer upon him the ability to speak. Everything that he says would be inert or sterile were it not done in partnership with the muse or with the goddess memory or with whichever particular divinity is kind of, it has to be a partnership. So, I mean, yeah, but I'm just simply struck by this idea that force subsists in this rhetoric rather than in this kind of reality, right? It's a function of language. It's a function of the way in which figures within the Iliad actually articulate themselves and their relationship in social hierarchies. So it's all one almost might, with Plato perhaps later on say that this force is almost entirely fictive in a sense, right? There's a sort of fictional notion of force at work there. Okay, so let me come to the way in which you work with Simone Weil. So when you have a chapter entitled Simone Weil and the Problem of Agency, chapter 4, and this is where you discuss the figure of Achilles. What is, in your view, the problem of agency that is raised here by force and by the way in which Simone Weil discusses it?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Simone Weil looms large in the whole project, and just even in terms of a background, the 4th chapter was an add-on, was not part of the original book, and it was actually suggested by me to me by Alex Purvis. She gets full credit for saying, you should look up Damazzo, and because what I had and Damazzo wasn't on my radar because it wasn't part of the set terms established by Bruno Snell and Emile Benveniste. But there was this continual question that I was having nonstop with anybody with whom I spoke about this project was, well, what about actual violence, right? And credit to Alex that she pinpointed the term. And I think, it produced in spades far more than even I had expected. But then the second problem, of course, is, well, what about Simone Weil? And what I was trying to do initially with the book is get away from this idea of force that we have with Weil's work, which is force as this sort of self-explanatory, I'm among friends, so I can speak, in Derridian language, a transcendental signified, right? The thing which represents itself and does not need any type of referent, right? What Derrida would say was equivalent to the sign, right? Because in order for deconstruction to work, you need sign to have its own essential meaning. Force is supposed to be that from Simone Weil. But what was really striking to me was then I said, okay, well, I need to obviously address Simone Weil because she looms so large, and she looms large in the history of structuralist thought as well. It's probably why these structuralist thinkers are going back. And what struck me was, in fact, despite how poetic her essay is, there's a very complex philosophic thought behind her. I have actually a much greater appreciation for Simone Weil's project, trying to, again, like basically applying the philological method to her term force and finding and tracing out the earlier renditions of her treatment of the Iliad and the sort of intellectual genealogy where force was not a factor. She talked about the Iliad. We have almost the exact same lines as the opening of Iliad ou Poème de la Force, except instead of force, the word is power, right? And so there's an obvious switch in her own genealogy and to force, and the question was why. And this, to me, I think was just so fascinating. Was it's actually, where does she get the term force? I think I'm pretty safe here. It comes as a response to Karl Marx and the concept of productive forces. I mean, she says that Marx is the first person to theorize force. And her response is, though, with Marx, of course, the theory of productive forces is that humans are brought along in this impersonal chain of history of the force of production, eventually leading, to the enslavement, which will then lead to the revolution. She uses the Iliad as a counterexample, that there are other forces other than the force of production. And she says these are destructive forces, and that's the force of war. And that it's not historical. It's not a question of historical progress. It's actually transhistorical. And so this, to me, is, that was a very strong idea. And then within that, thinking about, okay, and how does she contemplate this, right? Force is the hero of the poem. When she says that, right, she's saying force constitutes the subject, and all humans are the subjugated and the subjected, right? So who is the agent? The agent in Simone Weil's thinking is force itself, right? So there's that relationality there. And then when you look into the verb damazzo, that subjugated quality is so much present. It was, really striking, first from the different meanings based on the object of damazo. If it's an animal, it means to tame. If it's a woman as the object, it means to marry them. And if it's a man, it means to kill, right? Damazo is I say it's the poster child of toxic masculinity, right? Tame an animal, marry a woman, kill a man, it's all the same, right? But with that, even in terms of the philology, there's actually the problem of agency is built into it, into the formulaic uses. We have lines like when Zeus is contemplating the fate of Sarpedon, and he says, shall I kill Damaso Sarpedon at the hands of Patroclus? Try explaining that to your first year Greek students, right? We have an active verb with a hupo plus the genitive. So we have co-agents, we have double agency here, right? We have both human agency and divine agency happening at the same time. So the problem of agency for Vey is, of course, this problem that there is no agent except for force itself. And what happens then in the Iliad is that sort of transformed. The subject, the subject as subjugated still exists, but it's not force as its own subjects, it's the gods. And so to me, this is an important shift again, as I said, the sort of suspension of disbelief, to take the gods seriously in the poem and to think about what that means and how that's expressed. So this changes our appreciation and understanding of it, takes that level of relationality still there, right? Where Simone Weil is trying to shut off that relationality by making force itself the subject, right? That closes off, that endless cycle of exchange and this problem of, of interconnectedness. And by thinking about the gods in that way, that it opens it up again, I feel. So it's the actual philology that reflects this whole problem of subjective agency. And again, one of my favorite lines in the Iliad after going through this work is the line that Achilles says to Hector. He says, Athena will kill you with my spear. And, and taking that literally as, I had never read that line literally. I've read it hundreds of times, maybe. And, it's always, okay, Achilles is threatening to kill Hector. No, he's saying Athena will kill you, and I am the instrument in which this is happening. So what does that do from the perspective of the person as subject, viewing themselves as an instrument of force, and not just its object, but also its instrument, but never completely the sole agent and the sole responsible agent.
So there's almost like an instrumentalization of the subject of force as well as the object of force then.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And so it's this whole problem. I mean, it's the death of Patroclus, right? Is precisely this problem of agency, who done it, who was the person. And I don't think it's meant to actually be solved. This is precisely the problem of what happens when you're stuck within these relations of violence, right? Who is the person that actually ends up being responsible? You can even go back and think about this relation. I was thinking of you, Ben, with, there's another example, which would be the Buffonia ritual, right? Of killing the ox, the field ox, and eventually it's the knife that is proclaimed guilty and thrown in the ocean, right? So this problem of agency is built into Damaso, and it's precisely the problem that I think Simone Weil is trying to address. Is where do the agents stand? But by putting it back to the gods instead of making force its own, I think it opens up a different worldview and a different perspective on how these things operate, not just from a strictly passive perspective, but co-participation. It doesn't change.
Effectively, what you're doing here is, which is amazing, is you're really focusing attention back onto the way in which Greek thought, Greek literature kind of genealogizes conflict, right? It's like, so, that perennial question that you get in early Greek literature, who was responsible? What's the itios of any kind of conflict? Which I think, sits at the beginning of historiography as well, right? And it's a juridical question as much as anything else. As you said, with the Buffonia, the Buffonia is sort of represented as a trial. Who was responsible for killing the ox, and what you end up with is this kind of quite deeply complicated notion of agency, and therefore a certain indeterminacy that sits at the beginning of conflict, right? That it's a very contingent world that we live in, right, where the assignation of responsibility can never be total. It's always, there's always something else, if you like, a remainder. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I was just going to add to that, part of that problem. I mean, what happens when, I mean, this is sort of what occurred to me too, which is our presupposition is that of the individual. And if that is not the basis for the way in which, law is established, like our law is based on the fact of the individual. But if the subject is not conceptualized as an individual as such at this point in time, right? Or, I mean, time is a difficult thing here. We can get into that history problem. But just this presupposition about the individual, if we don't start from there, so many of the problems that we have are because we start from that presupposition. And what happens when we don't have that presupposition? And I think, now philosophically, we're in a place that we are asking that question with the work of Donna Haraway and posthumanism in general. I mean, everybody's facing it now with AI as well. The question of companion species or, co-species, symbiosis, these types of questions, all of a sudden, all of these problems that we have from the perspective of the individual change. I guess the question is not, who is the cause, who is responsible isn't necessarily who is the cause of the action, right? Yeah. So you might still serve the time for the crime, even if Zeus made you do it, or however that works, right? So
yeah, and you rightly point out that the source of that is a kind of Hegelian heroic individual that Schnell sort of sees as the end point of a kind of Western philosophical development, and that this is, of course, as Marx would point out, just a kind of alibi for bourgeois liberalism, right? And so therefore the individual is really constituted by a sort of 18th and 19th century social relation. And that what the Iliad does is it kind of throws a huge spanner in the works to that kind of imagining of the individual. I mean, the ramifications of this kind of work are huge, right? Because I think the other day I was teaching Aeschylus's Eumenides and the question of the emergence of a sort of democratic notion of justice, and the way in which human responsibility is articulated within that play. This has what you've done here is kind of has implications for how we would naturally read the Eumenides as a kind of, as a heroic step towards a kind of, autonomous notion of justice. No, perhaps not, right? I mean, the fact that the Furies are given a special place in the city suggests that different notions of causation and different notions of responsibility are still revered and still kind of respected and still worried about in a way, right? And this word Damasdo, I think you're so right to kind of focus on that. In fact, if you'd only focused on Damasdo, I think it would have been a success as well, because that word doesn't survive well into the classical period, into kind of classical Greek, but it does have these extraordinary forms like demoes, meaning slave, and and is it right, or am I right in thinking that it is cognate with words like dominus, or is that a mistake? I think you maybe complicated that etymology, didn't you?
Yeah, so it's technically not dominus. As much as I'd have to go back and look at my footnotes on the Indo-European there, but it's I think there's a difference there in the actual root. So it's not dominus, as much as we want to say that it's related to domination. And it works in terms of the English translation, certainly, but it's actually not, it's not cognate. So, yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the etymology of demoes and all those kind of weird Cretan words for slave, like menoia and so forth. And the etymological handbooks seem to want to link that to the word for house, right? Domos.
Yes, yeah.
And
I'd have to go back. I dug into that because I really wanted it to, to just use domination as the actual linguistic history to show that there's a linguistic history, but I believe it's not. I'd have to double check. Yeah.
But the word for wife, damar, is
Is related.
that is related to Damasdo, though, isn't it?
Yes, as a slave, yeah. And this, of
Yeah,
course, it gets into interesting problems with Aristotle, right? And this whole issue of the politics, right? And the role of slaves there, right?
yeah,
And the subject
absolutely.
and the question of the subject in Aristotle as well.
Well, in fact, you've kind of addressed my next question, which is, if you're in your conclusion, you speak about the ways in which your investigation can be situated in the problematization of that holy of holies of bourgeois liberalism, which is the autonomous individual rational subject, and I think your chapter 4 and the way in which you critique Simon Weil is like it nails it, and it just is. It's also just further proof of the way in which, as you said, a good old fashioned TLG search of words in Homer, or even using just Cunliffe, which is fantastic for that. Just throws up a complication of almost everything to do with the way that Western philosophy conceives of its objects. And so, a philological training is kind of, reasserts itself as fundamental for this sort of work. I'm going to finish off my part of the kind of questioning as we head into the half hour before turning over to the floor with perhaps a more curly question for you, which comes from my identity as a historian. And that is that there is philology becoming philosophy in your book, but what do we do about history? So my question then is that one of the key terms for force that you focus on is kratos, and that's a very and it's a thorny problem in its own right. But kratos brings up the shadow of the problem of politics and the problem of the city. And one of the last quotes from the Iliad that you make, which is just one of those quotes, as you say, that you read 1,000 times, but you've never actually reflected on it properly. But when Agamemnon says of Achilles that you want to have Kratos over all, and you want to rule everyone, right? And it's Agamemnon saying that of Achilles, not the other way around, right? Which is startling. It raises the specter of unlimited force. Right, this idea that it's possible for a man to have an infinite accumulation of power, but perhaps that's only possible in a world that has Tyranoi, right? Because the Tyrannos is the figure of the one who's able to acquire unlimited wealth, and power, and that in turn. To what extent is this kind of the possibility of an unlimitedness of power something that comes into being, as, for instance, Richard Seifert argues in his book on money, only in the sort of shadow of new economic, new social, new historical realities. So the larger question that I'm kind of getting to here is that the Iliad itself is an intervention. Is it a historical intervention? In other words, does it have a historical moment in which this problematization of subjectivity and agency and force corresponds to a kind of historical impulse in, say, for instance, the history of the Greek city? Or is that something that's over the horizon for you?
Well, it is over the horizon, but I will still try to answer, because it's not something it's something I have thought about. And originally this project, of course, all projects start out more ambitious than they want to be. I wanted to do a comparison of force across many different genres, literatures, and, try to do, say, a history. I would speak first maybe just a bit about Kratos there. And I think what's really interesting is the way in which it's conceptualized in the Iliad, or even if we follow Benveniste's definition, right, that Kratos is the result of a conflict, is an important conceptualization if we're thinking about events, right? It's not when we think, especially when we come to democracy, which is where I was, dealing with Derrida there, we think of the power of the people, the capacity to do things, right? And that's like Josh Ober, for instance, defines it as the capacity to do things, kratos. Benveniste's account, I think, is accurate as far as the Iliad is concerned, right? Which is that kratos is what you have after the contest. It's almost equivalent to victory. And it's anticipatory. If you have kratos, it turns out that you'll emerge victorious. And, you know, and Sean Train has argued that phairteros, I mean, that's another one, Ben, we could talk a lot about with your semantics of anaireo picking up, you know, phairteros meaning stronger is supposed to be phairing kratos, according to Sean Train, to take away victory, to carry it.
Wow.
But if we conceptualize kratos as happening from a moment of conflict, that there is no kratos without conflict. This is very important. So it's not dunamis. It's not the capacity to do something. It's from a moment of conflict. And what happens even with the term democracy, right? It's not power of the people. It's the victory of the people in the context of a conflict, right? So the agonism, you know, is already built in, I think, to this is getting to what you're talking about with the relationship to politics and the polis. There's an inherent conflict in agonism by which these relations of force are determinative. And that, I think, is built into Greek politics and the Greek polis. You know, that when we think about democracy as the capacity to do something or the power of the people to do something, that's missing the point of this event, the event of the conflict.
Yeah.
And so for me, democracy, if we think about it etymologically, and I think this works with Terteus, right? And others, like our early usages of you know, and kratos went to the demos, in the context of a conflict.
I think I think that's marvelous. I think that's marvelous. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that you were thinking of the great Retra there. You know, that the Damos shall have kratos. You know, there's that fragment of Solon where there's a textual problem. We don't know quite whether it's. He says, "I gave to the Damos sufficient either geras, or the other reading is kratos." Right. And in fact, what you're saying, you know, it becomes a huge crux, that emendation, right? I mean, which term do we how do we solve that problem? Because if it's geras, then one thinks about the demos having a privilege, which is perhaps connected to some kind of, you know, royal prerogative or something like that. But if it's kratos, then yeah, I mean, that's a whole other kind of question. Like, if kratos is connected to victory in that sense, which I really like. I think that idea is, and so that then entangles kratos with words like kudos as well.
Most definitely, and these are things that are given. And the other, I guess, the other point I wanted to follow up there, see if I can follow, is with regard to like whether or not this reflects a historical moment. I mean, I think there's also the question of why Homer and theory are so well tied together. It's, in one level, I think it's because the Iliad and the Odyssey sort of defy history, right? And in terms of both from this, both as being a prehistory, right? I mean, we can think about why it is that theorists love to cite etymology. Why is Benveniste so championed? Because it exists before history. And so therefore is a source for meaning that can be applied to history. And there's a way in which, you know, however we want to argue about the history of Homer and its textualization, Homer exists simultaneously at multiple points in history always, right? It's being performed at the same time as tragedy, right? And also before, and you know, so it exists both in and out of history. But related to that, I mean, whether or not it reflects on politics in a political moment, I think what's really interesting to me is with all of these, and I guess there's a point that I wanted to make too with the book, is that these relational terms, as much as every speaker that tries to assert a relation is asserting a certain hierarchy, the narrative of the poem undermines that hierarchy constantly. So you think a relation of force is fixed, and then the narrative overturns it. And so there's this constant resistance to hierarchy, is what I see as this overall theme that's happening. There's both acknowledging the will to hierarchy, the will to create fixed order and fixed sequence, and therefore fixed meaning and fixed relations. And that is continually being upended. Now, does that speak to a political moment in Greek history? I mean, perhaps it does, right? At least as a question of an anti-hierarchical agonistic model, right? That to me is, I think, an interesting point there. And also with that, following the idea of relationality, is just when, when we think about the history of the polis, we want to say the polis. But even if we're thinking about the situation of the Iliad, these conflicts are happening between the leaders of different communities, right? It's not about the polis, because, Agamemnon is not the king of, a single group here. It's an arbitrary one constituting several. It's more like a league, right? And so this other question that, the Iliad introduces, I think, is, does the polis ever come out, and does the polis doesn't come into existence, sui generis. It comes out, perhaps it's polis, its plurality has to always be there, these plural communities as opposed to singular communities within a fixed hierarchy. These issues, I think, are being raised there. So,
Well, if anything, I think in a very broad historical sense, what you've demonstrated, and I think what needs to be demonstrated more frequently, is that epic poetry has this critical dimension. It's calling into question, and the polis itself is a kind of meta institution for raising questions about conflict, its origins, and its resolution, and and contestation as well. I mean, to borrow, Tristan will sort of know what I'm talking about here, but to borrow that phrase of Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutics of suspicion. The epic poetry, or the Iliad at least, seems to be just loaded with that kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, which is, that nothing is stable and everything is kind of is contestable, particularly things like hierarchy and so on. So just when a Homeric hero seems to kind of have found his position on an essence, that essence is shown to kind of vanish into rhetoric, and I think if what you've done is to show that force kind of subsists in this rhetorical universe, then that alone perhaps is the sign of politics lying behind it in a way. But you're right to resist the desire to nail the Iliad to a kind of particular historical moment, which perhaps I did too strenuously in my book. But I've come around to thinking, like you've suggested, that there is something transhistorical about Homer. Maybe we don't know about the Iliad's performance context for a reason. It's because it broke free of its performance context to become something else, right? But look, I'm going to stop monopolizing you, Charles, now, and obviously, there's a lot that we've thrown up here, and so in accordance with our usual practice, if anyone would like to ask a question of Charles, I'm happy to keep pestering him with questions for the next sort of 20 minutes or so. But if there's anyone else who would like to raise a question, you can put up your hand or type the letter Q in the chat. Yeah, so Jack, you have a question?
Yes, yeah, I do. I guess I'm really interested in this notion of the co-agency of the subject, in particular with relation to orality. And I wondered what you would think about the ways in which I have Plato's Ion on the brain. So thinking about the rhapsode as both like son of Homer, divinely inspired, and also somehow a general as well, and whether force might get subdued in poetry. That it sounds like your like notions of these moments of force in the Iliad uh, often come with this co-agency of the god. In a way, that seems to be the practice of the rhapsode as well, a kind of co-agency to tell a story, to be able to recount for an audience. And I wonder if, like, in the spirit of the last question and the relationship to the development of the polis, like whether there is something like sort of more democratic, more civilized about a kind of subduing of force into poetry. that to express it through to turn the rhapsodes into Greece's best generals instead of actual violence, like a transference of violence to the muses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, with regard to the rhapsode, and I think this, I mean, the idea of co-agencies was something I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Manon Bouillet, who's part of the French school, and she speaks about it specifically in relationship to the rhapsode more, and this idea of divine inspiration, although she's addressing the issue of Agamemnon's, culpability as well. So I think the idea of co-agency is an almost, as far as the idea of the subject not having individual agency is absolutely vital, it applies to all the fields of performance, right? Whether it's, physical violence or sport or poetry, these all sort of are interchangeable. And it makes an interesting problem. I mean, that this is where the aspect of polytheism is also, I think, especially important. I often joke with my sport history students, like, there's a problem. Polytheism solves the problem when God wants one particular football team to win and not another, right? It's like, how do you solve that problem? So, well, if you're praying to different gods, right, then that can actually solve one of those issues. But with regard to that, to the other issue there, which is the sort of representational factor, I think I don't know if it subdues or sublimates violence. I know that, one thing I don't want to downplay is the sheer violence of the ancient world, and I think it might be a way to render it understandable or thinkable, I guess I should say. What do you do in the face of violence? How do you account for it? Co-agency might be a way that can help explain and justify and understand this process of violence that individual agency might not be able to handle, right? I don't know if I don't know if that really answers that part of your question, but I think there's a way in which it could be, it's a way to express the complications that questions of culpability don't solve, right? Or the events on the field, as it were, if we're thinking about war or sport or even poetic performance. Thank you, Jack. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it did. Thanks very much.
Andre, you're next.
Hi, Charles. Look, that was really a pleasure to meet you again on this occasion, and thank you, Ben, for the presentation, also so lucid and illuminating. I have a lot of questions, so let me briefly put you three small questions. So the one is, I guess, philological. So you quoted this verse, right? More or less, Athens kills you through my spear.
Mm-hmm.
And then you said, I gave a literal, I want to read it literally. So the question is, what does you mean by literal? Because obviously he's addressing his victim, right? So this is a relational situation. So how can you, so you see the problem, how can you draw an inference which concerns a thing, as you say, from this very situation? Let me put you the three questions in a row. So the second thing is, as I heard you, so you said at some point also that your initial project was more ambitious, and then it encompassed other genres. So in parentheses, I am so interested in what you did, because as you may know, I have worked on the laws where the problem of violence and relationship to persuasion is extremely complicated, and so on and so on. So I wonder whether we could at some point discuss these two. But leaving the laws apart, it seems to me that the genre where this kind of relationality between or problematization of what does a word mean, and so it's tragedy, because in tragedy you have an open discussion about the meanings of words, and even if you don't have the discussion about the meaning of words, the situation is such that the question is there, perhaps in a more obvious way than it is in Homer. So the question is, what about the relationship between the epic genre as a genre and tragedy as a genre? And then the third question is, well, about Simone Weil. I know that you wrote this essay. I just checked the date. It's 1941, right? So that's Germany invading various countries, yes, and Simone Weil taking a very strong position, and so on and so on. So what is, and she talks of force, which is not the obvious word for what is happening in Europe at this moment. So this is perhaps beyond, that perhaps needs to be simply put on the table, but I wonder whether you have, because you drew the line to Marx, right? I wonder whether that's correct, and whether euphemisation is at work with the use of force here, or not. I don't know. So that's a question about Simone Weil, which I don't know much about.
Sure, yeah. So thank you, Andre. These are great questions, and I really appreciate catching me on using the term literally, right? So there's a whole problem of reading that we can't get away from. I guess what I should have said is grammatically, I want to read the term grammatically, and there what I meant was to treat Athena as the subject. And this gets into that point that I make in the book, which is, Simone Weil, I mean, the line there is the famous line about the hot baths, actually, right? That, the hot baths, the famous quote from Simone Weil, which is, we're in war, everyone is far from the hot baths. I can't remember the exact quote, but in the line in Greek, right, it's addressing actually, it's the narrator. No, sorry. I'm confusing the two. So there's Achilles saying this, Athena will kill you with my spear. And then the narrator also says, speaking about Andromache, fool, she didn't know that far from the hot baths, Athena, Damazen, killed Hector with the hands of Achilles. So in terms of both the grammar there, we have Athena as the subject. And I think the first part is to take that. And what's interesting, and this gets to the issue of genre, is when we have this problem of the rhetoric of force, what's unique about the Iliad, or at least, as a genre, what's unique about epic is we have speech performance and we have narrative events that are speaking directly to these speech performances. So it would be much more difficult to figure out what's, the relationship between action and rhetoric, I guess I should say, except that the Iliad is able to do this. And to me, that's what was most striking, is the continuous commentary, or it seems like commentary, that the narration makes on these relations that the characters are trying to establish but don't quite work. Mm-hmm. And so in that case, we have this sort of confirmation between the speech of Achilles and the narrative poet making that same claim. And what's so interesting about it with regard to reception is that Simone Weil translated those differently, saying it's the arms of Achilles that killed Hector à cause de, because of Athena. And that's a completely different relationship in the sort of phenomenology of the event, right? To say that it's Achilles' hands killed, like grammatically, that Achilles' arms killed Hector because of Athena, as opposed to Athena killed Hector with Achilles' hands or with Achilles' arms. So this instrumentalization and the question of agency there is actively being, I think, pushed on us in the grammar, or at least conceptualized that way. So that's sort of what I meant by literally. And it's this question, and it's the problem of rhetoric, right? If we want, I guess it's why I didn't use the term rhetoric there, because it's hard to ever find those things. But it's what's so unique to me with the Iliad is that there is an opinion, right? Those things come forth. Even if we think about Iliad 2, this goes back to Ben's point when we're talking about sort of the scepter and these different ideas. When we reconstruct sort of divine hierarchies or divine born kingship, we go back to Iliad 2, the story of the scepter. The entire story of Iliad 2 is Zeus's deception of Agamemnon. When if we're reconstructing the sociology of kingship and divine kingship, this is our source for understanding the ideology of divine kingship, while the actual narrative is completely undermining the favoritism of Zeus that Zeus has towards Agamemnon. So the Iliad, and epic perhaps as a genre, affords this dimension by way of narrative. And this might get to your second question, which is this question about tragedy versus epic, I think, is we don't have in the same capacity this narrative commentary. Obviously, we have only the performative, right? And so the ways in which these things work out in a performative manner is much different than keeping track of this conflict between speech and narrative. You think about when like sort of proto-tragic moments of Hector realizing, oh, I've been deceived by Athena, death is calling me, these things. He has that realization, which is then also confirmed within the narrative as well. What happens when you take that narrative away? I think this creates an even much more dramatic and even more problematic scenario, because we don't have the firm ground of divine operation, I guess, that it's in action, but always in question. That's perhaps, and something I wanted to do but haven't, is to try to trace, does the language, and I know it does change, but the language of force in these particular terms, a lot of them fall out of favor. Does that change, right? And do we actually see changing concepts with regard, are these changing religious concepts with regard to, say, the issue of co-agency? Are they a function of genre and what's trying to be conveyed by way of the genre? Are these a function of different political and social contexts? I'm not sure, but that's one reason why I didn't get past Homer. But it's there for certainly, and I think it's this difference between performativity versus performativity plus narrative that gets at that. And you're absolutely right with Simone Weil. It was striking to me how much, certainly World War II as a part of that is probably the major context there for Simone Weil. And I guess what I was trying to emphasize is that so much of her writing and thinking was formulated before this, and specifically with her work with the labor movement, in a particular work, Oppression and Liberty. That's where she talks most about the Iliad. And then prior to that, also her own involvement in the Spanish Civil War as well. So it's not to downplay this other side, I guess I should, that's certainly not. And all of those things do come together, I think, in that moment. It's and of course, that's the thing that we can't ever take away from Simone Weil's, thesis, which is, nobody wins in war, right? And, the fact that even in 1941, she has writing in which she sympathizes with Nazi soldiers as much as she does with the Allies, and so she was really, as a person, was very much committed to this idea of the damage and the subjugation that force entails for all parties. And I think that
just an information question. Does Simone Weil? I understand that Simone Weil plays a role in France, but does she really plays a role on the English-speaking scene, so to speak?
She was translated into English quite early on. That essay in French was translated into English. I have to go back. It was a political journal that her essay was published in, and was quite popular. And she she was in America. She escaped to America and actually went back. And so she was a part of the English scene around that time, and actually went back before she passed away.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andre.
Tristan.
Thanks so much. I've loved this conversation. So my question kind of continues on from Ben's question about history and Andre's about Simone Weil. So, you know, let me preface the comment by saying one of the kind of key ideas for critical antiquities, as Ben and I think about it, is that by orienting ourselves to these ancient artifacts, it gives us an alternative vantage point from which to look upon our own conditions and to historicize them and to understand their particularity and their difference relative to the ancient past. And it strikes me that there's a way in which we could see the Iliad and your wonderful exploration of it in such philologically faithful ways as doing that for thinking about Weil and her account, which, you know, you rightly problematize. But it's to say that, like, in that spirit of the work that critical antiquities can do, it's to kind of say, well, like, what is it that Weil's interpretation of force in the Iliad actually says about her kind of moment? So the one that she's not historicizing as well as you are enabling us to do, but one which we can now kind of do with your book. And so it's to say, like, how is it that the particular circumstances of early 20th century European life are pointing to forms of force or sources of force that that aren't there in the ancient texts or aren't there in Homer, and yet are really helpful for understanding modernity and its specificity? And I kind of come at this because as I was reading your engagement with Weil, I was thinking of this, one of my favorite, interpretations of the modern novel by Milan Kundera, and I've just chucked it in the chat in case people want to have a look, because it's a wonderful and very brief. But if you'll indulge me, I'll just read a tiny bit of it, because Kundera is talking about the novel as this, like, preeminent genre for exploring the self, but then he kind of pivots and tries to specify the way that Kafka completely kind of upends this. And so he says, after reaching the depth, it's highlighted at the bottom of that first page, after reaching the depth involved in the detailed exploration of the self's interior life, the great novelist began, consciously or unconsciously, to seek a new orientation. We often hear of the holy trinity of the modern novel, Proust, Joyce, Kafka. In my view, that trinity does not exist. In my own personal history of the novel, it's Kafka who provided this new orientation, a post-Proustian orientation. His way of conceiving the self is totally unexpected. What is it that defines K, that is the character in the trial, as a unique being? Neither his physical appearance, we know nothing about that, nor his biography, we don't know it, nor his name, he has none, nor his memories, his predilections, his complexes. His behavior, his field of action is lamentably limited. His thoughts, yes, Kafka unceasingly traces K's reflections, but these are bent exclusively on the current situation. What should be done there, then and there, in the immediate circumstances? Go to the interrogation or evade it? Obey the priest's summons or not? All of K's interior life is absorbed by the situation he finds himself trapped in, and nothing that might refer beyond that situation, K's memories, his metaphysical reflections, his notions about other people, is revealed to us. For Proust, a man's interior universe comprises a miracle, an infinity that never ceases to amaze us, but that is not what amazes Kafka. He does not ask what internal motivations determine man's behavior. He asks a question that is radically different. What possibilities remain for a man in a world where the external determinants have become so overpowering that internal impulses no longer carry weight? Indeed, how could it have changed K's destiny and attitude if he had had homosexual inclinations or an unhappy love affair behind him? In no way. And what I love about that is kind of the way it suggests that we might want to say there's an operation of force going on in, say, Kafka's The Trial, though it's not called that. But I'm wondering whether you'd want to say, okay, there is a kind of modern operation of force, and it's very different from the way that you've explored it so richly in the Iliad. If in the Iliad, it's spoken about and it's rhetorically performed and then undone and complicated in this agon, in the modern era, the way that we should talk about force is this kind of bewildering and perplexing and inexplicable kind of experience of life that we can't even really call force because it's so bewildering, and yet it's kind of as good as we can get. So sorry for the long question, but that's just, I wanted to invite you to kind of think about the kind of the tensions and the differences that are at work there in this exploration of force in the ancient context and then in the modern.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you, Tristan. There's a lot there, and it's profound and very thinking about these implications and how that works. I mean, one thing we could say is, you know, even with Simone Weil perhaps articulated for us a conception, you know, we talk about force. Would we have been able to conceptualize this network of terms in the ancient world if we didn't have this organizing principle of an idea of force there? And we, you know, for whatever intellectual genealogy and influence of history, we're indebted to Weil for that, right? I mean, if Weil hadn't written her essay, would we see any connection between BA and Alke and Menos and Stenos? You know, would those actually even be related in any capacity, right? I mean, that, so this idea of force, you know, as much as I want to get away from it as a transcendental sign, you know, it's still there, organizing the meaning of all these other terms for us. And to the extent that, you know, that's possible, that's made possible by Weil, right? Yeah. I think. And so there's, you know, getting to that, I mean, you have this question, you know, are there ways in which, so could you re-articulate your question again? There's some other points that I had to make, but I wanted to make sure that I'm addressing your actual questions as well.
Yeah, thanks. I guess it really in the end is what disjunction could the kind of way that force operates in the Homeric text, and then the way that Weil talks about it, which seems to me, you know, adjacent to the way that Kafka, say, presents it. What kind of, how does it speak to a disjunction between the ancient and the modern worlds? And yeah, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this way in which it's precisely, to me, at least, that disjunction comes from the operation and the language of force in the Iliad makes us completely aware of the language. And so in some sense, there's a certain degree of awareness of the arbitrariness between signifier and signified, and the contextualization of these things, so that we get to the sense of the performativity, but also understanding what that performativity is doing that could be lost in the modern world. When we see this as a transcendental sign, and we see it just as there without question, right? There's a project that, you know, in other words, that the philological drive and the differences and the sort of that language, that feeling is there in the language itself. It's not just us as philologists teasing apart that difference. I think is felt in the language and how it's used. You know, even when we sort of formulaically see these repetition of phrases, right? You know, I could give you examples like, you know, the Zeus, you know, the Kratos esti Megiston formula, which is, you know, relates to Zeus. You know, Zeus has the greatest Kratos. That's repeated first by Agamemnon in his you know, in his testing speech, so he doesn't mean it. Then it's repeated again, you know, by Agamemnon in Iliad 9. This time he does mean it. And then it's repeated by Diomedes to say that Alke is the greatest Kratos, and Agamemnon, you don't have it. So that repetition of language really calls attention to the signifier and signified. And what I feel is the disjunction is a loss of that awareness of language operating as such. And to me, that's sort of, you know, that's the value, is understanding and seeing that, you know, what we could call like the sort of, you know, the philological intervention is a term I have, but, you know, especially now, you know, there's multiple ways in which we could talk about the present that I don't want to, you know, but now more than ever, you know, I think Simone Weil's sentiment should be circulated, you know, now more than ever. And at the same time, we see now more than ever, we see the circulation of language without it being examined, right? And from a technological perspective, with things like Twitter/X, right? We need the art of reading tweets slowly as well. But in terms of the circulation of language without being aware of language operating as such. And I don't know if there is that disjunction or not, but I feel like that is what that's what's needed now more than ever, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about that. Ben, you have a question?
I do. Thank you so much for this discussion. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. And Charles, really appreciating your clarity of thought. I have to preface my question by saying that I haven't yet read your book, but I am going to get myself a copy and not just borrow Ben's now that I know he has one. My question does have philosophical implications, but it's a little more pedantic in some ways, and concerns the history of Homeric scholarship. And I'm just wondering, when you speak of the relationality of force, it makes me think of the discourse around the relationality of mareness, and in particular of maybe Leonard Milner's work. So my question is, in considering the relationality of force, to what extent do you need to have a dialogue with this other set of relations around, the forces, if I can use the word, the forces of anger, as part of your project? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so Lenny's work is strong in my mind here, as well as like the language of emotions, right? These are all sort of interesting problems that get into this whole problem of embodiment, really, right? And how the Homeric body is conceptualized. That was sort of one of the ways in which I had started to think about this, and Bruno Snell's work was highlighted, or his work on force, or is mentioned. Snell's always talked about with regard to, there was no soma, that is the body, right? It was the corpse. Bruno Snell makes that point. There's the ways of seeing. The force term wasn't brought up mostly in our reception of Bruno Snell's work. But again, something like kolos is also really important there, and manus, and these relationships between them. I think of, especially with relationality, is Aristotle's definition of anger from the Rhetoric, right? Which is that strange complication about how when somebody that you perceive as lesser than, you're slighted by somebody perceived as lesser than you, right? So there's these multiple degrees of social relation that elicit the emotion. And when he says Aristotle says a lesser man cannot be angry at a greater man, right? So there's a sociology of emotions that's built into the actual emotion itself. And what's interesting then, I think, is if we take Aristotle's account, just saying a lesser man cannot be greater, what happens if you assert that I have that anger, then I'm actually making that assertion that I am greater than you, even if somehow I'm of a lesser position. So it still can be moved, and it's still dynamic. But again, I think that gets ultimately to this whole issue of embodiment, right? And how we conceptualize the human body itself in the ancient world. And I think, this idea, there's the container metaphor, right? And there's the work done by Lakoff, probably one of the greatest titles, his book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, right? Talking about why there's a universal language of, anger as heat, and this container metaphor of the body. So there might be some universalism to that. But with that, I mean, maybe not just the body as container, but the body as a field, right? And Frankl had called it, the Kosfeld, the field of power or whatever. But the body is environment, which allows for that relationality such that emotions are just as much a part of this as other things. And so again, but whether or not those, here's what's so interesting, I think, when thinking about distinctions in these, and this is also what's really valuable philologically, is which of these are conceptualized as being given by gods and which aren't, which are sort of generated from the event, from the relation itself, which of them are actually being imposed by gods. And, one that's not related, not manus, but metis, right? There's, of course, the metis-ba dichotomy. And this is something I was speaking with colleagues. I don't think metis is ever conceptualized as an object given by the gods, right? Whereas ba is. So that might be wrong. I haven't done the full search there. But thinking about that level in terms of the sort of religious perspective, which ones are conceptualized as gifts from the gods, which aren't, is another interesting factor to sort of map out all these different points of relation. But thank you for bringing that up, Ben. That's really useful.
Thank you.
The other two participants who wanted to ask questions have had to head off, and in fact it's just after 11, and I'm conscious of the fact that it's probably dinner time for you, Charles, and that you're in need of some refreshment and sustenance. I just was checking as a kind of denouement for this session, this workshop, the last words of book 24 of the Iliad. I'm always reminded of Greg Nodge's, view about programmatic statements, that men as the first word of the Iliad kind of resonates as a kind of an opening utterance all the way through and occupies the Iliad. But of course, final words are important too, aren't they, right? And the last word of the Iliad is hippodamoio, the tamer or the tamer of horses, Hector the tamer of horses. And that sort of, if the last word lingers in the ear as you hear the performance end, then that kind of, the last thing you hear is this kind of word about force, right? Force starts with anger, ends with force. Although I do note in the app Crit that one manuscript has, and then an Amazon came, the daughter of Ares, great-hearted manslaying, right? And so that, that might also have something to do, this is the idea of the manslaying sort of female warrior then sort of complicates everything, right? But look, it's unless there are any more questions, I'm going to let Charles off the hook and thank him very warmly from Tristan and I for participating in our Critical Antiquities Workshop series. And I can't urge all of you enough to read Charles's book. I think it's going to have a long importance, and it's going to be on many reading lists, and hopefully many undergraduates and postgraduates will read it, and it will be seeded into future Homeric scholarship. But thanks, Charles, for taking the time out to talk to us about it.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the time, whether you've read the book or not. And Ben, thank you and Tristan for your generous words about the book. And again, I just want to reiterate too how absolutely important I think and wonderful this network is.